What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Modern video. And Bant Nadu is easily one of the hottest decks in recent memory for the Modern format. Just the fact of how dominant it was at the Pro Tour and just the fact that it took center stage on one of the biggest stages that it could possibly be featured on and absolutely just stole the show. There's a lot of other cool things going on and all people could talk about was the famous Bird Wizard that it seemed from the day it was spoiled up until now has gotten some pretty high praise and has definitely lived up to those sky high expectations of creating Bird Summer. And while it's kind of fun to speculate and talk about how good this deck is, and we've already talked about the potential impact of like the modern metagame and whatnot, I kind of want to take today to explain why the Bant Nadu deck is so powerful, kind of why it's drawing these comparisons as decks like the colorless Eldrazi deck or the Eldrazi variants back in Eldrazi Winter. We have Hogak Summer, because these are the decks that Bant Nadu is getting compared to, and those decks famously dominated in their format, or at least had the perception that they were absolutely dominant, that they were very hard to compete against. And we have some of those stats and kind of things that I remember personally from that time in Magic, because really back in like Eldrazi Winter, that time was kind of like the height of where I started like really getting into competitive Magic, watching all the Pro Tours and everything like that. And then Hogak was definitely in the middle of kind of like that grind to get to the Pro Tour, do very well, qualify for the SCG Invitationals, stuff like that. So we're going to kind of go over in detail kind of like what makes the Bant Nadu deck so powerful and why it's so good in the current metagame, why people are saying that this deck could be one of the best modern decks of all time. Of course, going over some key stats from like the Pro Tour and kind of beyond, some additional thoughts, and then kind of comparing it to some of the other decks in the modern format that have been very powerful historically speaking. Of course, before we get too deep into talking about Nadu, talking about some of the other older modern formats, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the current modern and pioneer metagames and other things going on in those formats, along with some other longer form videos such as this. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell so you know when the future videos get posted, and it's a free, easy way to support me and my content as we journey to 1K subscribers. You're never going to hear the end of it until we get there, and then it's just going to be some other like arbitrarily like large number. But I'm having a lot of fun doing this. Y'all are keeping me young and spry in my old age, getting to talk about one of my favorite games of all time, so I greatly appreciate it. With all that said, let's go ahead, let's take a look at a Bant Nadu list and kind of talk about what exactly is going on and how it's able to dominate the modern metagame. So here we have Simon Nielsen's Bant Nadu list, the winner of Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3. And the deck itself is kind of unique in what is actually going on here and what's happening. And of course, I think a few things that make decks very powerful for the format is that they have to do something that is powerful, and they have to essentially be able to do it very consistently. We've had decks in Modern's history that are arguably very powerful. Things like, Grishol Brand, Neo Brand, whatever you want to call them, is kind of like the standard of like a very powerful deck. I mean, you're putting like Grishol Brand in play on like turn one. Even by today's standards, that is very powerful. Just it doesn't do it very consistently, and a lot of the times, even when you get to do the thing, it doesn't necessarily end with you winning the game, because there's a fail rate even past like that point. And Bant Nadu, in sort of kind of the same way, technically has a fail rate. Just when it fails, it doesn't just automatically lose the game. It's actually arguably set up in a position to where if your opponent can't interact, then you're absolutely going to win on the next turn. So at least like with this deck, when it fails, it's still in a way better position than what your opponent is by the start of their turn. So what exactly is going on with this deck? Of course, based around the card, Nadu Winged Wisdom, which says for 3 mana, 3/4, Bird Wizard with flying. Creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes a target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, put it to your hand. This ability only triggers only twice each turn. So instead of Nadu, like this effect, triggering twice each turn, no matter how many creatures you target, each creature can only trigger twice. So essentially, if you have 10 creatures on the battlefield, you have 10 creatures that each individually could trigger this ability twice each turn. And it makes things kind of weird because even if you play another Nadu and you legend rule the old one and you keep the new one, then you're able to then retarget those creatures and trigger those abilities 2 more times, which is kind of one way that you can keep going with this if you don't have that many creatures. Maybe if you're looking for something like a Spring Heart and Tuku or what have you, additional Nadus do kind of like reset the counter and allow you to keep going. Of course, Spring Heart being one of the best ways to continue to go off because you play a land and you can either make a copy of whatever it's enchanting or you just make a 1/1, which means that then you have another creature that can get targeted twice. If you hit fetch lands, then you're going to have 4 triggers. Well, the combo necessarily isn't deterministic, with only like 5 or 6 creatures on the battlefield. With like a Spring Heart and a Tuku or 2, you can surmise that in like 12 triggers of this ability that you're going to find at least 1 fetch land or a land even to kind of keep going, and then eventually get to the point where you're going to be able to deterministically like go through the rest of your deck and execute the combo. Speaking of executing the combo, while Thassa's Oracle was like the way to win with this deck online, and it's still like one of the ways that you can win online, which is arguably an even way worse version of the deck than what you can do in paper. Essentially, there's a way where, thanks to Sylvan Safekeeper, where you sack lands to give your creatures Shroud and protect them, that you can like sacrifice your lands in a certain way where you end up floating a bunch of mana, you sack your lands, and then you like use Endurance to kind of like loop them, so you can like put them back into your library and just like keep triggering the Spring Heart and Tucos. You can trigger Bristly Bills, make your creatures infinitely big, essentially. So like if you have Endurance plus a Spring Heart and Tuku put on it, you can then just like keep making copies of Endurances, and then you can make copies of 1/1s kind of as you're doing your thing. And then you loop a card called Otawara, Soaring City, and then the Beseiju, so you can blow up all of your opponents' like non-basic lands, artifacts, enchantments, and then you can bounce whatever else is left, leave them with only basics in play, and pass the turn. And you have Endurance who just put back a bunch of lands in your deck. Doesn't really matter. Like, you have a board full of creatures. Your opponent has essentially no relevant permanents in play, and it's very unlikely that they're able to kind of win the game from that position. So while the deck doesn't technically win on the spot, it does give your opponent a turn. It's kind of like a faux turn. Like, you basically win the game once you kind of establish this loop of like blowing up all your opponent's non-basic lands and any other relevant permanents, and then bouncing the rest of them. So the deck definitely has power. It is definitely pretty consistent in what it gets to do, because you can get like these mana dorks and like Delighted Halfling. Shuko being one of the key pieces to the deck you're able to find off of Urza Saga, which really can only find Shuko in this deck. You can also get Haywire Might as well to kind of interact with like the One Ring. But overall, Saga is getting one of your pieces, while like Court of Calling can go and get Outrider Encore, which is like another way that you can kind of combo and do your thing, and you can even do it at instant speed because you're not stuck with the sorcery speed cost, I guess, of Shuko, where normally it doesn't matter. The fact that Shuko is, only equipped at sorcery speed doesn't really matter too much. Because, if your opponent's able to interact with it, they're able to interact with it. The problem is, I've seen way too many times where someone's tried to kill a Nadu, and, like, I don't know, like, they flipped over a land with, like, an Entuku in play. So it's then given them enough things to be able to Court of Calling for 1 to go get a Sylvan Safekeeper to then protect the Nadu. And Sylvan Safekeeper is such a sneaky addition to this deck, because even though it's a one-of, the fact that it can target one of your creatures, triggering the Nadu, it also then protects it, and you can just sacrifice land. So unless you're like on the hook for like a Summoner's Pact, Sylvan Safekeeper is just going to be able to protect your creature through X amount of removal, where X is the amount of lands that you have. And then you're also going to get to trigger the Nadu's abilities and whatnot, and like your other creatures' abilities, which also kind of helps when you're kind of looping through your things and whatnot. Another new addition, like Shifting Woodlands, if you have Delirium, you can pay 2 and double green, and it becomes a copy of target permanent in the graveyard until end of turn, which, you can have Shifting Woodland become a copy of Nadu, you can have it become a copy of Shuko, and then you can just kind of continue to combo from there, do something, even like the Outrider Encore, you can make a copy of it, and like that's another instant speed way that you can kind of go off and win the game that way. Basically, whatever you need this Shifting Woodland to be, as long as it's in your graveyard, you're going to be able to copy it. And in a lot of cases, the fact that you can use the Woodland to tap it for mana and then also use it to activate its ability as well. Now, it doesn't matter if Shuko's tapped or if Nadu's tapped or whatever, you still get all these triggers of getting to kind of go through and filter through your deck until you're able to, hopefully increase the morale of your opponent by flooding the board with 1/1s and blowing up again all the relevant permanents. While in theory, this makes the deck a little bit worse playing online, as I say before. You're essentially stuck playing like Thassa's Oracle or just making a ton of 1/1 tokens, passing the turn to your opponent with full mana, where currently one of the second most played decks in the format is playing the Wrath of the Skies, and basically just has a bunch of different ways of clearing the board full of creatures. So it's not necessarily ideal to not be able to loop Boseiju and Otawara, but that's kind of like the point, right? Like, this deck is way worse online than it is in paper because of some of the concessions that you have to make to be able to win the game on time, which is totally a valid way of winning the game on Magic Online, is your opponent using up too much time and timing out. You're not obligated to scoop to anybody. I'd say for mental health reasons that you probably should, and the fact that, again, in paper, you're probably going to win that game depending on what side you're on, but that's neither here nor there. Like, this deck is arguably a lot weaker compared to the online version, or compared to the paper version, and the deck is still one of the most played decks in the format. Not by far. It's definitely a lower percentage than most of the dominating decks of the format, like the Hogaaks and the Rakdos Scams and the eventual Eldrazi's of the world. Like, Nadu being at just under 10% is probably one of the lowest I remember seeing a deck post Pro Tour. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the main loop that you would do to kind of win the game and essentially completely close the door on your opponent, you're not able to do in a reasonable time, where you have to just kind of settle for a board full of 1/1s and your opponent having all their mana. And I think in a few matchups, that's totally fine. You can essentially, win the game from that sort of point. You can kind of loop for a few turns to bounce your opponent's important permanents, or, blow up some of their important cards and whatnot. But I think at the end of the day, you're definitely playing a worse version if you are just having to play online, because you have to make that concession of time being a factor and kind of acknowledge that fact. But that's kind of where the Nadu deck, again, kind of gets its power. While it's not doing something that necessarily wins the game on the spot, even though I guess it technically can, it doesn't really necessarily need to, and it kind of does anyway, with the consistency of having cards like Summoner's Pact, Quarter Calling, and the fact that all of its creatures, once a Nadu hits the battlefield, including Nadu, are super hard to kill, thanks to the fact that you're going to 2-for-1 your opponent no matter what. They're going to spend a card to try to get rid of your card, but then you're also going to get a card back, or potentially another land drop, which then can get you another creature, can go and get you counters on your other creatures, or in a lot of cases just set up a Quarter Calling for a Sylvan Safekeeper, and your opponent already has to have 2 different removal spells, at that point, to then get rid of Nadu. And then if you ever find another Nadu, either with another Quarter Calling, Summoner's Pact, you're more than likely just going to be able to go off with that one, because that's forcing your opponent to have a lot of interaction and try to put pressure on this deck. It's hard to put pressure on the deck because Nintuku just making 1/1s, unless your opponent's creatures have trample, the fact of just making 1/1s and being able to kind of block, their potentially biggest creature each turn, and then just, again, force them to have to kind of find removal for the Springheart and Nintuko, or for the Nadu. And the fact that Springheart you can also just bestow on a creature, so then they need to have 2 removal spells to truly deal with the Springheart, in most scenarios. I know that there's something like Route the Skies does take care of Springheart and Tuco, even if it is bestowed onto a creature. But again, that's kind of, one card, or at least like one of the cards in a bunch of cards that people are choosing to play as like removal in the format that can actually deal with the Springheart in either scenario, where most decks are going to have to use 2 cards to try to get rid of it. This deck is full of just 2-for-1s that just kind of punish your opponent for targeting your creatures. And again, the ultimate punish of just, I'm going to kill your thing. Well, I'm going to cord for a thing that protects my things, and then I'm also going to be able to trigger it, and you can sort of kind of go off with Safekeeper as well in like a weird way to hopefully find a Springheart and then kind of do its thing. So that is Bant Nadu. That's kind of what it's doing, and and on all these different cases, the fact that it is kind of this like creature toolbox deck that is going to be able to get whatever it needs to get for whatever situation, and that it's like parts are very, very powerful and do a very good job of just, being annoying, and, Delighted Halflings and Noble Hierarchs, Sylvan Safekeepers, tokens from from Springheart and Tuco, Wall of Roots. Like, all these cards are very powerful cards that do very powerful things individually, given for their costs and whatnot. And like all together, they just make it life very hard for your opponent if they're trying to interact with kind of what you have going on. So, that's Nadu. I have some stats and stuff of the deck from the Pro Tour, kind of some of the other things from, what we've seen from the deck lists that have been kind of dumped now that we have Moto deck lists and whatnot, and how they kind of stack up to some of the other achievements and things like that from things like Rakdos Scam, the Hogak decks, and from the Eldrazi decks as well, kind of from their respective eras, and kind of see if Bant Nadu has kind of like a claim, if there's, a substantiated feeling, claim, whatever, to Nadu being considered one of the best modern decks of all time, or if we're just, shoving one of just the best decks currently right now as one of these all-time greats. So let's kind of go ahead and take a look at some stats here. So this is an article written post Pro Tour Modern Horizons 3. And at the very start of the article, it says, according to the Pro Tour metagame breakdown, the most popular archetype was Bant Nadu at 20%. We saw that Nadu was like 20%. The Storm deck was at like 9.3%, I believe. And for what it's worth, Bant Nadu also had like a 5% of like the metagame. So I think total between like the Bant version of Nadu and the 4-color Nadu version, it was about a quarter of the Pro Tour metagame was some variant of Nadu. There was also some other versions as well, but like these were the 2 most popular, and obviously with hindsight, the best performing Nadu decks. The article does go on to say that it wasn't the highest metagame share of any one archetype at a Pro Tour. There was 31% Jund midrange in 2012 and 28% Abzan midrange in 2015. And I would argue that that's kind of okay I think it's a little bit more okay for mid-range decks, because it's a little bit harder to like mitigate exactly what's going on, because a lot of mid-range decks just play very efficient cards for what they do, or very versatile cards. So basically you're just admitting to some of these cards just kind of being like very pushed. So I guess in that way you can ban them, but it's a little bit harder for me to like justify bannings for mid-range decks, unless you're just Scam, where, you play like a mid-range deck as like your B plan, but your A plan is, double Thoughtseize your opponent on turn 1 and hope that they can't play Magic from that point. But I digress. Bant Nadu being 20% of the field was very high, but not the highest, but it had presumably been the highest that we've seen since 2015. So we're almost 10 years past this point where, we have tons of, power creep from this point, and Nadu was still 20% of the field. And again, going into this Pro Tour, from the day that Nadu was spoiled up until now, is going to be considered one of the best decks to play, and even got nicknamed Bird Summer before doing anything. Definitely drawing some kind of like Ben Simmons-esque comparisons where, it's the Prince that's promised. We have the, kind of the all-star, the player that everyone's like, this is the next GOAT, and, we're kind of waiting to see how it plays out. But so far, so good. definitely the hype ended up being real. 20% of the field, 25% if you include 4-color Nadu, and it did extremely well. So here's an entire table of, kind of in order by win rate of decks that performed very well at the Pro Tour or did not perform very well. And, we see Nadu here at 59.3%, a 178 and 122 record against the non-mirror, non-draw, non-buy match record for every archetype in the the Swiss rounds. In the standard Swiss rounds, it doesn't include the top 8 rounds or whatnot, to which Nadu ended up winning all the non-mirror matches in the top 8. So the only decks that really had a higher percentage, we see Dimir Murktide, Living End, Band Control, Mardu Midrange, and Domain Zoo. The only kind of, I would say, outlier, whatever you want to call it, for this sort of thing is the fact that between these, 5 archetypes, there were 7 decks. Dimir Murktide had 1 player, Living End had 3 players, Band Control, Mardu Midrange, and Domain all had 1. Bant Nadu at a 59.3% win rate above everybody else had 49 players playing the deck. And you had 4-color Nadu playing 13, so significantly less. You see E-Tron and like Mono Black Necro having more players. But you have a 59% win rate as the Bant deck with 49 players playing the deck. 178 wins to 122 losses. And then you have the 4-color Nadu deck at 63 wins and 50 losses, good enough for just under 56%, just a little worse than Boros Burn, who had 10 less players playing the deck. The fact that the only players that really had like a higher win rate than Bant Nadu and 4-color Nadu, the most played deck was 4 different players. And that got a 56.7% win rate, which is more than Nadu, but Nadu also had 9 players. 4-color Nadu had 9 more players than Girl Prowess and was like, what was that, like less than 1% worse in terms of win-loss than Girl Prowess, which is pretty nuts because, again, this deck was known coming into it. It was known that there was a kind of like stock list in Bant, and then like 4-color was kind of like the way that you can like beat the mirror, which reminds me a lot of Hogak Pro Tour, or I guess Mythic Championship, where we saw Hogak playing main deck Leyline of the Void as like a way to combat Hogak, and that was kind of like the format revolved around, where the rest of the decks could potentially beat the Hogak deck that was playing main deck Leyline. But they really didn't have that good of a matchup against the regular Hogak decks, and the regular Hogak decks had to worry about the mirror match that was playing Leyline of the Void. So definitely interesting that a lot of players, like, their way of beating Bant Nadu was just to play 4-color Nadu. We see some other win rates from some of the other decks, with like Sultai Vengevine, being the last deck to cross the 50% threshold. Jeskai Control, which is like the deck that players kind of dubbed the Nadu killer, or at least seemed like it was a very good choice against the Nadu deck. And for about 2 games against Simon Nielsen, Javier definitely, at least to me, had me convinced that Jeskai Control probably could have won the event and actually taken down Nadu. Only had a 49% win rate, which is important because this is currently the second most played deck at the time of this recording. The second most played deck according to MTG Goldfish. So 49% win rate at the Pro Tour. Nadu, 59.3%, and it's kind of like little brother variant, just under 56%. So he's short on here. Although the sample size were relatively small, of course, it's just 49 players, but like head and shoulders, more than anybody else in the format. A lot more than anybody else, by almost 30, probably I think over 30 decks. The astounding non-mirror, non-draw, non-buy win rate of Nadu was 59.3%. The corresponding 95% confidence interval ranged from 53.5% to 64.9%, indicating a very strong performance for the most played deck in the field. For comparison, Rakdos Grief had a 54% win rate at Pro Tour Lord of the Rings in 2023, and Hogak had a 56% win rate at Mythic Championship 4 in 2019. This makes Bant Nadu's performance one of the best in modern Pro Tour history, and 4-color Nadu was not far behind. The fact that this deck was the most played deck in this field, and was, like, oh, it was 20%, but it wasn't 28% like Jund or 31% like the Abzan mid-range decks, but it was, presumably the third highest percentage of a deck registered for a Modern Pro Tour, and it had one of the best win rates of all time. Is absolutely insane for a deck that people knew about coming into the event as well, where people were able to kind of, and you saw a little bit of kind of that play where people were able to kind of make plays that would disrupt the Nadu deck and whatnot, but normally those plays came from other Nadu decks and just obviously playing a ton of mirrors and whatnot against the deck. Other large tournaments at MagicCon: 75K Modern Open, the Second Chance PTQ, Secret Lair Showdown, and Modern Cup. Featured fewer Bant Nadu decks and more variety overall, but their non-mirror, non-draw, non-buy win rate of Bant Nadu across the tournament was very similar at 59.1%. Even if some players have been slightly underprepared for the Bant Nadu matchup, the bird is certainly the word. Other popular decks underperformed at the Pro Tour metagame. In particular, people were ready for Ruby Storm, which is famously a really bad decision because that's probably the deck I would have played, just because I thought that would have been a great Nadu kind of like matchup where you could more than likely win game 1 and you just kind of hope to steal game 2 or game 3. And turns out players were not able to steal game 2 or game 3, even if your name is Luis Scott Vargas, Kai Buddha, and John Finkel as well. So I believe John Finkel was there. I know at least those two players were there, and that was the Storm deck that they picked up and played. And, a famously bad decision, if I say so myself. But this is kind of some of the idea that we're getting here with like this Nadu deck. We know that 5 copies of Nadu made the top 8, 4 of them specifically being Bant, 1 of them being 4-color. They won all the non-mirror matches in the top 8, meaning that we were set up for a 4-color Nadu versus Bant, and then a Bant mirror match, and then set up with a Bant mirror match in the top 8. Spoilers, I guess, if you haven't watched the Pro Tour yet, but we're like a few weeks removed from this, and you've probably already heard all the discourse and stuff from kind of what is going on with this deck currently. So definitely a deck that going into the Pro Tour was very hyped. People knew that this was going to be a thing, and players still trying to prepare for it and either just didn't come prepared with the right things to fight it, or did, and it just didn't really matter. Obviously, a very high metagame percentage, also converting into a very high win percentage, being almost 60%, and this kind of like adjusted interval range of 53.5 to 64.9. I mean, even at 53.5%, it's only slightly worse than Rakdos Grief at the absolute worst. And then at best, it just thoroughly outpaces Hogak. Now, the scam decks didn't perform very well at the Pro Tour. Granted, it did win, compared to something like Nadu and Eldrazi, the Rakdos Grief decks and the Hogak decks didn't perform all that well. Hogak made put one copy in the top 8 of its Mythic Championship, and that player lost in the quarterfinals. While Rakdos Grief had one player make the top 8 and ended up winning the event, Jacob Beardsley, shout out to him, ended up winning the event with the Rakdos Scam deck, even though he was the only player to put a copy in the top 8, where we have, again, 5 Nadu decks that made the top 8, 4 being the Bant version, 1 being the 4-color version, and then Eldrazi put 6 decks in the top 8 versus, I think 2 of them, I think like Frank was technically playing something different, but we had multiple colorless Eldrazi decks. There was a blue-red Eldrazi deck, and then there was Eldrazi like processors, which played differently, I believe, from like the 2 of them. But in any case, like the core of the decks were for the most part the same, based around like Ayavugan and whatnot, and just trying to power out some very powerful Eldrazi, some very pushed Eldrazi creatures for the time to just kind of, take over the game and really beat down your opponent very effectively, I might add. So really, at this current moment, the only thing that is kind of like knocking Nadu right now for me in terms of, naming it one of the best decks of all time. I think it certainly is one of the greatest modern decks of all time. But like to be named the greatest modern deck of all time, and I think the only thing that's really hurting it is the fact that the way that it wins the game and how it would go about doing it online is a lot worse than what it is in paper. I think the fact that we don't have Grand Prix and SCG Opens and things like that, we don't have any like big events that players can play in. We're also not in the modern RCQ season yet either. I think is kind of a knock to Nadu, and that's nothing that it could possibly do other than, us shifting the seasons around and Pioneer RCQ season ending earlier to start modern RCQ season earlier. But overall, from everything that the Nadu deck can kind of control, it is by far one of the greatest modern decks of all time. And I certainly think that if you put it head to head, I mean, we've seen like MTG Goldfish ended up playing, Nadu versus Hogak, and Hogak absolutely obliterated the Nadu deck. Maybe if Nadu drew a little bit better or whatnot, it would have ended up playing out a lot better. But I also think like Hogak and Eldrazi are kind of like the gold standard of, if you want to be a very busted deck in the format, if you want to be do something that is very powerful and essentially nearly deterministic. I mean, Hogak pre Bridge from Below banning and post Bridge from Below banning was like the best deck in the format, period, point blank. Eldrazi, I believe in one of the wikis that I read, where I'll link it in the description, said that the Eldrazi deck had, 6 of 8 decks in the top 8 were Eldrazi. The next major event that was played, like 48 or 49%, something like that, the top 100 decks were 47% of the meta from GPs, and I believe 48.8% from the SCG Open that took place sometime after the Pro Tour, and it put 14 decks in the top 8 of a possible of 24 between 3 Grand Prix, and it won 2 of the Grand Prix. Like, Eldrazi is one of the most dominant decks of all time. We've seen Eldrazi versus Hogak across like multiple channels and stuff, and I always feel like the Eldrazi deck kind of gets better than the Hogak deck, but like those are 2 like titans among titans of the format, and Nadu certainly has a claim to being one of the greatest modern decks of all time. I think it just needs a little bit more time in the format, but so far it is definitely living up to the hype. It is kind of coming out from the, on paper, this is going to be, drawing Michael Jordan comparisons, and at least currently right now, it absolutely is living up to kind of like that high expectation of, creating essentially a toxic format, which is kind of like the benchmark, I guess, for being one of the most powerful decks of all time. So even if at this point, like Nadu Summer, if the deck were to get banned, whether via an emergency ban or banned in August, like we have our scheduled announcement for, I think that Nadu certainly is one of the best decks of all time. It at least has like a claim and somewhat of an argument for being better than something like Hogak, even though Hogak was definitely dominant in 2 different eras, if you will, pre and post banning. That the fact that Nadu kind of isn't going to get that, or seems like it's not going to get that luxury of, having something else banned from it and then seeing if it will kind of maintain its status in the metagame or whatnot. It certainly has everything else. You have players essentially playing a pseudo mirror, but playing like black to try and, get one up on the other, like the most played version of the deck, which again, I also think helps the deck out a lot in terms of like metagame share, because if you have people bouncing between the 4-color version and the banned version, it's going to keep, both numbers down, even though you have like, say 15-16% of the metagame playing Nadu versus like 7% of like another deck, which is a pretty high discrepancy and whatnot. So definitely Nadu is one of the most consistent decks of all time. Again, it has the benefit of like power creep and whatnot. In theory, it should be better than its predecessors and whatnot, but there's been some pretty broken things in modern history, and Nadu certainly feels and looks to continue to be one of the most powerful things you can do in the modern format. So I guess for the time being, we should probably just kind of enjoy what we're seeing from the Nadu deck as a whole, and just kind of embrace our bird overlord for the time being, and just wait for something to happen, because it's only a matter of time until something actually happens to the deck. And, you know, again, we'll be having conversations like this of like, where does it stand in some of the greatest archetypes of all time? And again, I think it certainly has a seat at the table. But that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like on the video. Comment down below if you think Nadu is one of the greatest modern decks of all time, as I kind of, you know, again, kind of like fan the flames. I kind of just put it up on like a higher pedestal and whatnot. You know, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you can be notified of future videos such as this and other things pertaining to the Modern and Pioneer format. Of course, you know, I greatly appreciate all the support and whatnot, because y'all are amazing. Y'all keep me making videos and stuff, and I enjoy the heck out of doing it. So please, please, please keep that up. I absolutely love it. But yeah, that's going to do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all in the next one.